Before we start the video, comment where you are watching from, the time you are watching, and which story you like. I've never told anyone the full truth about what happened in the Black Hills during the autumn of 1955. The official reports list 11 deaths, 8 members of the Lakota tribe, and 3 park rangers. Cause of death: animal attack, likely mountain lion or bear. The case remains unsolved. But I know what really occurred during those blood-soaked weeks. I was there. I saw it. And sometimes, in my darkest dreams, I become it once again. My name is Mark Sullivan. I served as a ranger in Black Hills National Forest for 27 years before retiring in 1972. Most of those years blur together now. Routine patrols, lost hikers, occasional poachers. But 1955 stands apart like a wound that never truly healed. It started with missing hunters. 3 Lakota men failed to return from a ceremonial hunt in late September. Their families were worried, but not overly so. These were experienced outdoorsmen who knew the hills better than anyone. But something felt wrong about it. Maybe it was the way their tracks simply ended in the middle of a game trail, as if they'd been plucked right off the earth. Or maybe it was the strange symbols we found carved into nearby trees, ancient markings I'd never seen before, despite my familiarity with local indigenous customs. 2 weeks later, we found the first body. I still remember the sound of my partner Jim retching in the bushes when we came upon it. The victim, later identified as Thomas Black Elk, one of the missing hunters, lay spread eagle in a perfect circle of stones. His skin had been removed with surgical precision, leaving only raw muscle and sinew exposed to the autumn air. Most disturbing was his face, frozen in an expression of absolute terror, yet somehow peaceful too, as if he'd seen something both horrifying and beautiful in his final moments. The medical examiner was baffled. No animal could have done this. The skin removal was too precise, too methodical. But if it was murder, what kind of person would be capable of such butchery? And why arrange the body so ceremonially? More disappearances followed: 2 hikers from Michigan, a local game warden, 4 more Lakota hunters. Each time, we'd find their skinless remains days later, arranged in those damn stone circles. The papers started calling it the work of the flesh taker. Tourists canceled their trips. The hills grew quiet, except for the wind that seemed to carry whispers just beyond understanding. That's when I started seeing her. The first time was at dusk, while I was investigating one of the ritual sites. A flash of movement caught my eye, a woman standing between the pines about 50 yards away. Even in the failing light, I could see she was strikingly beautiful, with long black hair and copper skin that seemed to glow. She wore a traditional buckskin dress adorned with intricate beadwork. "Ma'am?" I called out, reaching for my flashlight. "This area's restricted. Are you lost?" She turned to look at me, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes reflected the light like a deer's, glowing amber in the beam. Then she smiled. Not a human smile, but something ancient and predatory. Before I could move or speak, she darted away with impossible speed, leaving only disturbed leaves in her wake. I told myself I was seeing things. The stress of the investigation was getting to me. But deep down, I knew better. I'd heard the old stories from Lakota elders about the deer woman, a shape-shifting spirit who lured men to their doom. I'd always dismissed them as legends. Now I wasn't so sure. She appeared to me 3 more times over the next week. Each encounter left me both terrified and strangely drawn to her. There was something hypnotic about her presence, a pull I couldn't resist even though every instinct screamed danger. The night of the blood moon, everything came to a head. We'd assembled a large search party, myself, 4 other rangers, and 6 Lakota hunters, to do one final sweep of the area where most of the disappearances had occurred. The moon hung low and red in the sky, casting everything in a crimson glow that made the shadows seem alive. That's when we heard the singing. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, beautiful and terrible at once, like 1,000 voices crying out in ecstasy and agony. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Several of the Lakota men dropped to their knees, covering their ears and praying in their native tongue. She appeared in the clearing before us, more beautiful and terrible than ever. Her dress now seemed to be made of living shadows that writhed and twisted around her. Where human legs should have been, delicate deer limbs carried her across the frost-covered ground with impossible grace. "You've come," she said, her voice resonating in our minds rather than our ears. "All of you, just as the old ones foretold." What happened next still haunts my nightmares. The beautiful facade melted away like wax, revealing something ancient and unknowable beneath. Her true form was a thing of angles that shouldn't exist, of teeth within teeth within teeth. The air itself seemed to bleed around her. The slaughter began before anyone could react. She moved like liquid darkness through our group, her touch bringing exquisite agony as she peeled away skin and sanity in equal measure. I watched in helpless horror as my companions were flayed alive, their screams mixing with that terrible singing. I alone was spared the knife, but what happened to me was far worse. As the others died around me, she pressed her impossible face to mine and breathed something into me. Something old, something hungry. I fled into the hills that night, running until my legs gave out. When I finally stopped, I realized with dawning horror that my reflection in a stream showed eyes that glowed like a deer's in the darkness. The official investigation concluded 3 days later. They found the bodies of my companions, all skinless, arranged in the largest ritual circle yet discovered. I was the sole survivor, with no memory of how I'd escaped, or so I told them. I continued serving as a ranger for 17 more years. I had to stay close to the hills, had to protect people from what lurked there, had to feed the hunger that now lived inside me, choosing my victims carefully, drifters mostly, those who wouldn't be missed. I'm an old man now, writing this from my nursing home bed. The hunger has grown weaker with age, but never truly left. Sometimes I catch glimpses of my reflection, just for a moment, and see something else looking back. Something with too many teeth and eyes that glow like a deer's in the dark. The nurses say I get confused, that I mix up dreams with reality. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was all just the delusions of a man who saw too much death and needed a way to make sense of it. But if you find yourself in the Black Hills on a moonlit night, and you see a beautiful woman standing among the pines, run. Run as fast and far as you can, because the flesh taker is still there, still hungry, and some hungers never die. The end. The cold has a way of preserving things, memories, bodies, secrets. I should know. I've kept mine frozen for over 60 years now. But lately, the nightmares have been getting worse, and my doctor says writing it all down might help. I doubt it. Some things should stay buried in the ice. My name is Catherine Wells. In 1961, I was a 28-year-old ranger stationed at Mount McKinley National Park. That's what they called Denali back then. Young, ambitious, and desperate to prove myself in a male-dominated field, I took the winter post that nobody else wanted. Looking back, I understand why they all refused. It started with Chester McPherson's distress call. A seasoned trapper, Chester had worked these mountains for 30 years. He knew every cave, every pass, every danger the wilderness could throw at him. So when his voice crackled over the radio that December morning, trembling with fear, I knew something was wrong. "Catherine? Catherine, you there?" Static punctuated his words. Something's following me. Been 3 days now. Keeps calling out in Tom's voice. But Tom's been missing since. The transmission cut out. Tom Barrett was another trapper who'd vanished 2 weeks earlier. We'd found his cabin empty, the door wide open, letting in the snow. Half-eaten breakfast still on the table, coffee frozen solid in the mug. No tracks leading away. Just silence and that damned open door. I should have called for backup. Should have waited for spring, when the military could send a proper search party. But Chester was my friend. He'd taught me to read the mountain's moods, to respect its ancient rhythms. So I packed my gear, radioed my position to base, and set out into the deepening winter. The first day passed without incident. The sky hung low and gray, heavy with unspent snow. My snowshoes left crisp tracks in the powder, the only sound for miles besides my own breathing. I followed Chester's last known route toward the high country, where the old ice caves riddled the mountainside like Swiss cheese. As dusk approached, I found his first camp. The tent was still standing, but something was wrong. The snow around it was disturbed in a way I'd never seen before, not from bears or wolves or any wildlife I knew. The tracks were huge, almost human-like, but distorted, and they led straight into a narrow crevasse. I made camp nearby, telling myself the strange howling in the distance was just the wind. But wind doesn't call out in Chester's voice, asking for help. "Catherine? Catherine, please. I'm hurt. In here." I clutched my rifle tighter and tried to ignore the way the voice shifted, becoming Tom's, then others I didn't recognize. Voices that shouldn't exist up here in the isolation of winter. By morning, I hadn't slept at all. The crevasse opened into a larger cave system. I'd explored some of these passages in summer, but winter transformed them. Ice crystallized on the walls in bizarre patterns, catching my lamplight and throwing it back in fractured rainbows. The air felt wrong, too still, too thick with the metallic taste of old copper. The first body I found was Tom's. He was frozen solid, half embedded in the cave wall like some grotesque museum display. His face was contorted in terror, mouth open in a silent scream. But it was his eyes that haunted me. They were missing, replaced by smooth ice that seemed to swirl with something dark beneath the surface. I almost missed the bite marks at first. They weren't like anything I'd seen before, not bear, not wolf. The edges were too clean, almost surgical, and some of the flesh appeared, sampled as if something had been taste testing. Before I could radio base, I heard Chester's voice again, closer now. "Catherine, thank God. I'm just around the bend. Hurry." I knew it couldn't be him, knew I should retreat, but I had to know. The passage twisted deeper into the mountain. More bodies appeared, trapped in the ice like insects in amber. Old bodies, bodies that shouldn't be here. A gold rush prospector still clutching his pan. A native hunter with equipment centuries old, all partially eaten, all with those same ice-filled eyes. The storm hit without warning. I heard the wind's roar echoing through the caves and knew I was trapped. My radio crackled with static, then died completely. The temperature plummeted until my breath froze in crystalline clouds before my face. That's when I first saw it, the Keelut. The ancient ones had warnings about it, but we wouldn't listen. Why should we? We were modern people, armed with science and certainty. It emerged from the shadows like a living piece of darkness, wolf-like, but wrong, too large, too angular. Its fur wasn't fur at all, but thousands of translucent ice crystals that shifted and chimed with its movement. But its eyes, God, its eyes were human, swirling with all the memories, all the voices it had consumed. "Catherine," it spoke with Chester's voice. "So hungry, so very hungry." What followed? I can't. Even now, 60 years later, I can't fully write what happened next. The chase through the tunnels, the others I found trapped down there with me. The choices I had to make to survive those 2 weeks in the dark. They found me in spring, half mad and barely alive. The official report says I survived on emergency rations and melted ice. They cleaned me up, gave me a medal for heroism in the face of extreme conditions, blamed the missing trappers on the storm. But they never found the bodies, never found the cave system again. The entrance had collapsed in an avalanche, and they never asked about the strange new hunger that came back with me. The way winter calls to me now, pulling me toward the high country where the ice grows thick and voices echo in the dark. I retired from the Park Service soon after, moved to Arizona where the sun burns hot and bright. But every winter I dream of those ice caves, of what's still down there, waiting, growing stronger, collecting voices. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, I catch myself speaking in Chester's voice, calling out to strangers who pass too close to my home. The hunger never really goes away, it just hibernates. I've worked as a cave rescue specialist in Kentucky's Mammoth Cave System for 23 years. In all that time, I've seen 3 people die, 2 from falls, 1 from hypothermia. Clean deaths, natural deaths. But what happened in the summer of 1968 still haunts me, still makes me wake up screaming some nights, clawing at my face to make sure it's still my own. My name is Timothy Ross. At least, that's the name I was born with. These days, I'm not so sure anymore. It started like any other rescue operation. A group of 5 spelunkers had missed their exit time by 12 hours. Standard procedure was to wait 24 hours before mounting a full rescue operation. Caves are tricky, and it's common for groups to lose track of time or take longer than expected navigating difficult passages. But something about this one felt wrong from the start. The missing group had been headed to a newly discovered section of the cave system, a branch that split off from the Echo River Passage. Our surveyors had only mapped it partially, but initial reports suggested it connected to a vast network of unexplored chambers. The Spelunkersol experienced cavers from the University of Louisville had obtained special permits to conduct geological surveys in the area. When the call came in, I was already on site, finishing up paperwork from my day shift. Sheriff Mills knew me well enough to know I'd want to head up the rescue operation myself. "Tim," he said, his voice crackling over the radio, "we got a situation. Group of 5, overdue since yesterday afternoon. No radio contact." I remember checking my watch. 9:47 p.m. The summer sun had long since set, but that doesn't mean much when you work underground. "Any signs of distress?" I asked, already reaching for my gear. "Nothing concrete," Mills replied. "But their base camp radio's been picking up some weird interference. Static mostly, but..." He hesitated. "Well, the operator swears he heard screaming mixed in with it." I assembled my team quickly. Jake Martinez, our medical specialist, Sarah Chen, our best climber, and the Williams twins, Tom and Dave, who knew the cave system better than their own homes. We were geared up and ready to enter within 30 minutes. The entrance to the new passage was about 2 hours in from the tourist section. We moved quickly, our helmet lights cutting through the darkness, our footsteps echoing off limestone walls that had stood silent for millions of years. The air grew colder as we descended, and the familiar musty smell of the cavia mixture of wet rock and bat guanos somehow sharper, more metallic. We found their first camp at the 3-hour mark. Everything was in order. Sleeping bags neatly arranged, cooking equipment cleaned and stored properly, survey equipment laid out methodically. Too methodically. In my experience, even the most organized cavers leave some signs of human presence. A candy wrapper tucked into a crevice, boot prints in the mud, something. This camp looked staged, like a museum display of what a cave camp should look like. "Check this out." Sarah called from near the cave wall. She was examining something with her helmet light, her breath visible in the beam. I moved closer, and my blood ran cold. The wall was covered in paintings. Now, cave paintings aren't unusual in Kentucky's cave systems. Native Americans used these caves for thousands of years, and we regularly find pictographs and petroglyphs, but these were different. The pigments looked fresh, still glistening in our lights, and the images. They showed humanoid figures, drawn in a style I'd never seen before. The bodies were elongated, almost transparent, with hollow spaces where faces should have been. Below them were more normal human figures, and the transparent beings appeared to be, reaching inside them, pulling something out through their mouths. Beneath the images was a single line of text, written in what looked like modern spray paint. They, steel faces. This has to be some kind of joke, Jake said, but his voice shook slightly. The missing group must have done this. I ran my fingers over the paintings. The pigment was cool and slick like fresh blood. Let's keep moving, I said. They must have gone deeper in. The passage narrowed as we continued, forcing us to walk single file. The walls here were different, smoother, almost polished looking, with strange circular depressions about the size of dinner plates scattered across them. The air grew colder still, and that metallic smell became overwhelming. We found the second camp an hour later, and everything changed. This camp showed signs of panic. Equipment was scattered everywhere, sleeping bags torn, supplies spilled across the cave floor. Our lights revealed boot prints in the mud, showing where people had run in different directions. And the walls, every surface was covered in the same warning, written over and over in increasingly frantic handwriting. They steal faces, they steal faces, they steal faces. Tim, Tom Williams whispered, look at this. He was holding up a camera, remarkably intact among the chaos. The last photo on it showed 3 of the missing spelunkers standing by a cave formation. They were smiling, but something was wrong with their faces. The image was slightly blurred, but their features seemed to be sliding, like wax melting under heat. That's when we heard it, a sound like wet leather being stretched, coming from deeper in the cave, and human voices calling for help. This way, Dave shouted, already moving toward the sounds. We followed, our training overriding our growing fear. The passage opened into a massive chamber, our lights barely reaching the ceiling. The floor was dotted with pools of dark water, and the air was thick with that metallic smell, so strong now it made my eyes water. The voices were clearer here, desperate cries echoing from multiple directions. We split up our first mistake. I took the left passage, following what sounded like a woman's voice. The walls here were covered in those circular depressions, but now I could see they weren't natural. They were too perfect, too regular, and some of them looked fresh. I found her around the next bend. She was facing away from me, her long hair matted with cave mud, her clothes torn and dirty. Ma'am? I called out. I'm Ranger Ross. We're here to help. She turned slowly, and I dropped my flashlight. Where her face should have been was smooth, blank skin, like a mannequin. As I watched, horrified, the skin began to ripple and tear, revealing something underneath something, pale and translucent, with clusters of dark organs visible through its flesh. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, screaming into my radio for the others to get out. Their only responses were static and screams. The next few hours are a blur in my memory. I remember running through passages that shouldn't have existed, hearing the wet, slapping sounds of pursuit behind me. I remember finding Dave Williams, or something wearing Dave's face, the features sliding around on its head like oil on water. I remember seeing transparent figures emerging from the walls, their bodies elongated and fluid, reaching for me with hands that seemed to phase through solid rock. Somehow, I made it out. I emerged into the pre-dawn light, my clothes soaked with sweat and cave water, my radio silent. Search parties found no trace of my team or the original missing spelunkers. The new passage was sealed off by a convenient cave-in before a proper investigation could begin. That was 56 years ago. I retired from cave rescue work immediately afterward, moved to Arizona where there are no major cave systems. I avoid mirrors now, because sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch my reflection and my face. It doesn't quite fit right anymore. The features shift slightly when I'm not looking directly at them. And late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can feel something moving under my skin trying to break free. I know what you're thinking, that this is just the story of a traumatized man, that grief and guilt have twisted my memories into something horrific. I thought the same thing for years. But last week I received a letter. Inside was a single photograph, taken by that camera we found in the cave. It shows me, standing with my rescue team before we entered the cave. Everyone's face is normal except mine. In the photo, my face is completely smooth, like a blank canvas waiting to be filled. The fish started dying in March of '75. At first we thought it was just another chemical spill from one of those fancy new plants up in Baton Rouge. Lord knows we'd seen enough of those over the years. But this was different. The fish weren't floating belly up like usual. They were missing pieces. I'm Marcus Wright, and I was a ranger with Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries back then. 26 years old and thinking I knew everything there was to know about these waters. Funny how life has a way of showing you just how wrong you can be. The first reports came in from some catfish farmers near Henderson. Their stock was getting torn apart at night. Not eaten clean like you'd expect from gators. These fish looked like something had just taken big, random chunks out of them while they were still alive. The wounds had this strange pattern to them, almost like giant teeth marks, but wider than any gator I'd ever seen. I remember that first morning I went out to investigate. The air was thick with that special kind of Louisiana spring humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin before the sun's even fully up. The bayou was quiet, too quiet. Usually you'd hear birds calling, insects buzzing, maybe a splash here and there from fish jumping. But that morning there was nothing but the soft lapping of water against my boat and the occasional distant cry of a lone heron. The farmers had set up underwater lights to try and spot whatever was attacking their stock. Ain't never seen nothing like it, Ranger Wright. Old Jimmy Thibodeau told me, shaking his head. Whatever it is, it ain't natural. Been farming these waters 30 years, and this is different. I took water samples, documented the damage, and started mapping out where the attacks were happening. That's when I noticed the pattern. Whatever this thing was, it was moving up the waterways, getting closer to more populated areas, and it was getting bolder. By April, we started getting reports of missing boats. Small ones at first, John boats, little fishing skiffs. They just disappear overnight, leaving nothing but broken rope and sometimes a few scraps of metal. I coordinated with the parish sheriff's office to drag some of the deeper spots where boats had gone missing. What we found, well, that's when things started getting really strange. The first dive turned up pieces of boats all right, but they weren't recent. We found chunks of wood and metal that looked decades old, all collected in this one deep spot, like some kind of underwater graveyard. But that wasn't the worst part. Mixed in with all that debris, we found bones. Human bones. Lots of them. The official story was that we'd discovered an old riverboat accident site, but I knew better. These bones weren't all from one accident. They were from different times, different people. Some looked ancient, others more recent. All of them had those same strange marks we'd seen on the fish. I started doing research, digging through old newspaper archives and talking to the oldest folks I could find along the bayou. That's when I first heard whispers about the Rougarou. Now, everyone in Louisiana knows about the Rougarou legends, our version of the werewolf. But the stories these old-timers were telling were different. They spoke of something that lived in the water, something that had been there since before the French settlers arrived. The native tribes had known about it, they said. They'd given it offerings to keep it sleeping in the deep parts of the bayou. But something had woken it up. I didn't want to believe it. Hell, I still told myself it had to be some kind of massive alligator, maybe one that had grown way beyond normal size. That theory held up until the night of May 15th, when I saw it with my own eyes. I was out on night patrol, checking some of the spots where we'd had recent attacks. The moon was full, turning the Spanish moss into silver curtains above the black water. I'd cut my engine to drift, listening to the night sounds, when I heard something big move in the water behind me. When I turned with my spotlight, I caught just a glimpse at first, a massive shape, bigger than any gator I'd ever seen, sliding beneath the surface. But then it rose up, and, God help me, I still have trouble describing what I saw. It was like someone had taken a werewolf and given it gator features. The head was long like an alligator's, but the snout was shorter, broader, filled with teeth that curved in all different directions. Its eyes, they weren't gator eyes. They were almost human, but wrong, too intelligent, too aware. The body was covered in scales and fur, patches of both, like nature couldn't decide what it wanted this thing to be. When it rose up out of the water, it must have been 15 feet tall, and that was just the upper body. I emptied my rifle into it. Might as well have been throwing pebbles. The bullets just sparked off those scales, and where they hit flesh, the wounds closed almost instantly. It came for my boat then, and I only survived by ramming into a shallow spot and scrambling onto land. I watched it tear my patrol boat apart like it was made of paper. After that night, I tried to get the authorities to close the waterways. But tourist season was ramping up, and nobody wanted to hear about monster stories from some young ranger. Besides, the attacks had seemed to stop. Looking back, I realize now it was just biding its time, waiting for something bigger. The Riverboat Queen was the largest pleasure boat operating in our section of the bayou. Every year during Mardi Gras, they'd do this special midnight cruise, pack the boat full of tourists and locals wanting to party on the water. 300 people, easy, all drunk on hurricanes and the festive spirit, not a care in the world. I tried to stop it. I begged the harbor master, called the Coast Guard, even tried to get the parish police involved. Nobody would listen. "You're just worked up over some big gator," they said. "Have a drink, enjoy the party." The attack started just after midnight. We were about 2 hours into the cruise when the first impact hit. The whole boat shuddered like we'd run aground, but we were in one of the deepest parts of the bayou. The music kept playing, people kept dancing, probably thinking it was just rough water. Then it hit again, harder. People started screaming as they lost their footing. I ran to the railing and shined my light down at the water. In the beam, I caught sight of that scaled hide sliding past, bigger than ever. It had grown. The third hit knocked out the power. We were in complete darkness except for the moon and the few emergency lights running on batteries. That's when the panic really started. People were screaming, rushing for the lifeboats. But I knew those small boats would just be easier targets. I fought my way to the bridge. Captain Landry was trying to radio for help, but all he was getting was static. The thing was circling us now, getting ready for its real attack. I could see its wake in the moonlight, like some kind of living whirlpool surrounding the boat. When it finally came for us, it rose up right in front of the bow. In the moonlight, it looked like a mountain of scales and fur and teeth. People were screaming, crying, praying. The boat's spotlight caught it full in those horrible eyes, and in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I shoved the captain aside and grabbed the controls. The thing's mouth was open, ready to tear into the bow. I pushed the engines to full power and aimed straight for those teeth. The impact was tremendous. The boat's bow crumpled, but our momentum drove us deep into the creature's throat. I could hear it roaring, feel it thrashing. Water was pouring in everywhere. People were being thrown overboard by the dozens. The last thing I remember is hitting the emergency fuel dump while yanking the flare gun from its mount. I fired into the spreading fuel just as the water reached my chest. The explosion was. I don't really remember much after that. They found me 2 days later, clinging to a piece of the wheelhouse. Out of 312 people on board, only 47 survived. The official report blamed it on a drunk captain and an illegal fuel leak. They never found the creature's body. The explosion and fire should have killed anything living, but they never found it, just like they never found most of the bodies of the people who went into the water that night. I quit the ranger service after that, couldn't go back on the water, moved up to Shreveport and took a job selling insurance. But every now and then, I see something in the news about missing boats or mysterious attacks in the bayou, and I wonder. The old-timers used to say that the Rougarou could only be killed by a sacrifice freely given. 40 lives I helped send to the bottom that night. And sometimes I think that still wasn't enough. Because on quiet nights, when the moon is full, I swear I can hear something moving in the water. Something big, something hungry. And it's still growing. The worst part about what happened in Death Valley wasn't the pain. It wasn't even watching my own body become a nursery for those things. No, the worst part was knowing that I could have prevented it all if I'd just listened to the voices in the wind that first night. I've worked as a park ranger in Death Valley for 12 years. Name's Antonio Reyes. The desert has its own rules, its own logic, and I thought I understood them all. But what happened in the summer of 1987 showed me how wrong I was. I'm writing this down now because the doctors say the thorns are approaching my heart, and soon I won't be able to warn anyone else. It started with a routine search and rescue operation. A team of archaeologists from UC Berkeley had missed their second check-in. 3 days of radio silence from a 5-person team that was supposed to be excavating some newly discovered Native American ruins in the Funeral Mountains. Usually, when people go missing out here, it's because they underestimated the heat or ran out of water. But Dr. Sarah Chen, the team leader, was experienced. She'd done digs all across the Southwest. Something felt off about this one from the start. I packed my Jeep with extra supplies and headed out at dawn. The temperature was already pushing 95 degrees, and the sun had barely cleared the horizon. The archaeologists' last known coordinates led to a remote valley I'd never explored before, even though I thought I knew every inch of this park. The first sign something was wrong came when I spotted their base camp. Everything was perfectly intact, tents still standing, equipment laid out, half-drunk coffee cups on the folding table. No signs of struggle, no panic, just abandonment. Their satellite phone lay on a camp chair, its battery dead. The team's journal entries stopped mid-sentence, right after a note about finding an entrance to what they believed was an underground pueblo. I followed their trail markers to a narrow canyon. The walls were decorated with petroglyphs I'd never seen before, abstract shapes that seemed to writhe and shift in my peripheral vision. But it was the silence that really got to me. Death Valley is never truly quiet. There's always wind, birds, the rustle of small animals. Here, though, it was like someone had pressed a mute button on the world. The pueblo entrance was partially hidden behind a rockfall, but recently cleared. Modern climbing ropes disappeared into the darkness. I radioed my position back to base, clicked on my flashlight, and went in. The temperature dropped at least 20 degrees as I descended. The beam of my light revealed walls of perfectly fitted stone blocks, far more sophisticated than any pueblo architecture I'd ever seen. And then I found the first body. It wasn't one of the archaeologists. This was old, centuries old, but perfectly preserved. A natural mummy, desiccated by the dry desert air. The corpse was contorted, frozen in a position of agony, with what looked like thorns or spines protruding from its flesh. I've seen my share of dead bodies in this job, but something about this one made my skin crawl. Its mouth was open in a silent scream, and there were growths sprouting from its eye sockets. I found more bodies as I went deeper, dozens of them, all in similar positions, all with the same thorny protrusions. The air grew thick with the smell of dust and something else, something sweet and organic, like rotting fruit. In what must have been the central chamber, I found the archaeology team's equipment scattered across the floor. Their notebooks described finding more mummies, and pottery covered in warnings about those who grow in the rain. The final entry, in Dr. Chen's hurried handwriting, mentioned hearing scratching sounds in the walls and seeing movement in the shadows. That's when I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like cacti needles dragging across stone. I swung my flashlight toward the noise and caught a glimpse of something impossible. It was roughly the size of a mountain lion, but its body seemed to be composed entirely of living thorns and spines. They shifted and rippled as it moved, creating that horrible scratching sound. Where its eyes should have been, there were clusters of small white flowers that glowed with their own inner light. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. 20 years in law enforcement, 12 as a ranger, and I ran like a scared kid, but I wasn't fast enough. In the narrow tunnel leading to the surface, I felt the first sting, a single spine embedding itself in my back. By the time I reached my Jeep, dozens more had found their mark. The radio crackled to life as I sped back toward civilization. The Weather Service was issuing an unusual warning. An unexpected storm system was moving in, bringing the first rain Death Valley had seen in months. I felt them then, the thorns inside me, responding to the mention of rain. They quivered with anticipation. Looking down at my arms, I could see them beginning to sprout through my skin, tiny white flowers already beginning to bloom. The pain comes in waves now. The hospital doctors don't know what to make of my condition. They've tried removing the thorns, but they just grow back faster. Through my window, I can see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The flowers growing from my flesh are opening, releasing a sweet, heavy scent that fills the room. And in the wind, I hear those voices again, singing about the rain. The nurses think I'm delirious when I beg them to burn my body before the storm hits. They don't understand that every drop of rain will help birth something ancient and hungry. They don't know that the Pueblo wasn't a dwelling place, it was a nursery. And now, I'm just another host, another mummy in waiting, feeling the seeds of something terrible preparing to bloom. To whoever finds this, stay out of the desert when it rains. If you hear voices in the wind, run. And if you see flowers blooming where no flowers should grow, remember my story. Remember what happened to Antonio Reyes in Death Valley in the summer of 1987, when the rains came and brought something worse than death with them. I've worked as a ranger in the Green Bank Forest for 15 years. The dense Appalachian wilderness has been my home, my sanctuary. I know every trail, every hollow, every ridgeline. But what happened at the radio telescope facility in the winter of '91? I still can't make sense of it. Some nights I wake up screaming, grateful for the darkness that hides what my ruined eyes can no longer see. Writing this down feels impossible. My hands shake just thinking about it. But people need to know the truth about what occurred in those woods, about the thing we awoke, about why the Green Bank Observatory implemented their strict radio silence policy. Most importantly, about why you should never, ever look directly at the Mothman. It started with the interference reports. As a ranger, I regularly coordinated with the observatory staff about wildlife affecting their equipment. Usually it was bears scratching antenna poles or birds nesting in the dishes. But in late November, Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead researcher, reported unprecedented disruptions in their deep space signals. The patterns make no sense, Pete. She told me over coffee in the facility cafeteria. Dark circles ringed her eyes from too many sleepless nights. It's like something's talking back. I remember how her hands trembled as she showed me the readouts. Waves of static punctuated by sharp spikes, forming patterns too regular to be natural interference. Could be faulty equipment, I suggested. Or maybe atmospheric disturbance. Sarah shook her head. We've ruled out all known sources. Whatever this is, it's responding to our transmissions, changing its signals based on our input. Pete, I think we're communicating with something. I should have recognized the manic gleam in her eyes. Should have shut down the whole facility right then. But who was I to question the scientists? Just a simple forest ranger. The first death came 3 days later. I was doing my evening patrol when the emergency call crackled over my radio. Dr. James Morton, one of the night shift operators, had been found in the control room. The official report said he died of a massive stroke. What it didn't mention was the expression of absolute terror frozen on his face, or how all the monitoring equipment in a 20-foot radius had been completely fried. But worst of all were his eyes. The doctors claimed they'd burst from a sudden spike in blood pressure, but I saw the body before they took it away. Those weren't burst eyes. They'd been carefully, surgically removed, along with his eardrums. The facility should have been evacuated then, But Sarah insisted they were on the verge of a breakthrough. The signal patterns had intensified, becoming more complex, more deliberate. She said they were teaching it to communicate. God help me. I let them continue. Over the next week, the forest changed. The usual nighttime sounds, owls, crickets, wind in the trees, fell silent. Rangers reported strange lights moving through the woods. Hikers complained of disorientation, lost time, and a pervasive sense of being watched. Then the dream started. Everyone at the facility reported the same nightmare. Standing in absolute darkness while a vast presence loomed overhead, trying desperately not to look up. Those who did look up in the dream woke up screaming. 2 researchers had to be sedated after attempting to claw out their own eyes. I first saw it on December 3rd, during a late-night perimeter check. The fog had rolled in thick, reducing visibility to mere feet. My flashlight beam seemed to be absorbed by the mist rather than penetrating it. That's when I heard the humming. It started as a low vibration, more felt than heard, rising from somewhere ahead. Following the sound, I emerged into a small clearing. The fog had thinned here, spiraling upward in a lazy vortex. And there, perched on top of a dead oak tree, was something that defied comprehension. Its form seemed to shift and flow, refusing to resolve into anything solid. 10 feet tall at least, with vast wings that didn't so much flap as ripple through dimensions that shouldn't exist. But its eyes. Christ, its eyes. Dozens of them, glowing red, each one reflecting a different possible future. All of them focused on me. I know now that I should have run, should have burned the whole forest down. But in that moment, I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The humming grew louder, resonating in my skull until I thought my head would split open. Then it spoke, not with words but with visions, flashes of what was coming. Cities in flames, oceans boiling, the sky torn open like tissue paper as things poured through. And humanity, oh God, what we would become. I don't know how long I stood there, drowning in those apocalyptic visions. When I finally snapped out of it, I was on my knees, blood running from my nose and ears. The entity was gone, leaving only a lingering afterimage burned into my retinas like a photographic negative. The next few days passed in a blur of mounting horror. More researchers died, each found with eyes and ears removed. Those who survived descended into paranoid madness. They claimed the signal was inside their heads now, showing them things, teaching them truths no human was meant to know. Sarah was the worst. I found her in the control room late one night, surrounded by monitors displaying impossible mathematical equations. She'd gouged out her own eyes, but claimed she could still see. "It's beautiful," she whispered, blood running down her cheeks. "The grand design. We're all just static, Pete. Random noise in the night wire, but it's going to make us part of the pattern." The final night is mostly fragments in my memory. Alarms blaring, screams echoing through the corridors, researchers attacking each other with whatever weapons they could find, trying to free each other's eyes from the prison of sight. And above it all, that damned humming, growing louder and louder. I remember running through the chaos, trying to reach the main power controls. The whole facility had to be shut down, had to stop the transmission before. I found myself in the central observation dome. All the screens were alive with static, forming patterns that hurt to look at. And there it was, perched on the radio telescope dish like some monstrous bird, the Mothman, the prophet, the thing that sees. Its wings blocked out the stars as it unfurled them. Those horrible eyes, each one showing a different way the world would end, turned to fix on me. The humming became a scream that threatened to tear reality apart. I knew I couldn't look away in time, knew what those visions would do to my sanity, so I did the only thing I could. I pulled out my knife and took my own eyes. The official report calls it a mass hysteria event triggered by chemical leak. The facility was shut down, the survivors quietly transferred or committed. The government sealed the records and implemented strict regulations about radio transmissions in the area. But I know the truth. Whatever we contacted through that radio telescope, it's still out there, still watching, still waiting to show humanity what it saw in those transmissions from deep space. I live in darkness now, which is a mercy. But sometimes, in my dreams, I still see through those ruined eyes, still witness the 1,000 possible apocalypses reflected in the Mothman's gaze, and I wake up screaming, grateful that I can no longer see what lurks in the shadows, grateful that I can no longer witness what's coming. But I can still hear the humming, getting closer, getting louder. It's only a matter of time now. Found among the personal effects of Peter Walsh following his disappearance in 1994, the Green Bank Observatory maintains strict radio silence to this day. I never wanted to write this down. Some things should stay buried in memory, locked away where they can't spread like a disease of the mind. But after what happened at Station 23 last August, I owe it to them, to everyone who died, to tell the truth. Maybe then someone will understand why I did what I did, why I had to. They'll find this journal eventually. The rangers who replace us will come looking when the radio silence stretches too long. They'll break through the ice-covered windows and find our frozen bodies, preserved like ancient specimens in a museum of horror. They'll want answers. This is my attempt to provide them, though I doubt anyone will believe me. I barely believe it myself, and I lived it. It started with Martin Webb's group, 3 experienced hikers who should have been perfectly fine on a marked summer trail. When the call came in about missing hikers, I figured it was the usual. Twisted ankle, wrong turn, maybe heat exhaustion. Just another routine search and rescue in the Adirondacks. Funny how your whole life can pivot on what you dismiss as routine. The morning was bright and warm when I set out, the kind of perfect July day that draws thousands to these mountains. Summer insects hummed in the undergrowth, and sunshine filtered through the canopy in lazy shafts. Everything normal. Everything right. I found their first campsite easily enough, following the coordinates from their permit. Nothing seemed disturbed. The tent was properly set up, sleeping bags laid out inside. Their food was still hanging in a bear bag, untouched. But something felt wrong in a way I couldn't name, like the forest was holding its breath. The temperature dropped as I followed their trail, which made no sense. The weather report showed highs in the 80s all week, yet my thermometer read 45 degrees. I pulled on my jacket, watching my breath cloud in air that should have been summer warm. I found Sarah Miller first, propped against a tree like she was resting. Her skin had a blue tinge I initially blamed on the strange light filtering through the leaves. But when I touched her arm, it was hard as marble, frozen solid. Her eyes were open, glazed with frost despite the warm air. I've seen my share of death in these mountains, but this was different. Wrong. Her expression wasn't one of pain or fear, just surprise, like something impossible had happened too quickly to process. The radio crackled when I called it in, static drowning half my words. The temperature kept dropping. By the time backup arrived, it was below freezing in a 10-foot radius around Sarah's body. We found Martin and Kevin half a mile ahead, in similar condition. The coroner later said their organs were crystallized, frozen from the inside out. Like something had sucked the heat from their bodies, starting with their cores. I should have requested a transfer right then, should have walked away. But I've spent 20 years in these mountains. They're my responsibility, my home. So I stayed, started investigating, started noticing patterns in old reports I'd dismissed before. Missing hikers found frozen in summer heat, strange cold spots that moved against the wind, shadows that seemed too solid at twilight. The stories were always there in local legend, passed down by the original inhabitants of these mountains, tales of ancient things that came with the glaciers and never left, living in deep caves and forgotten hollows. The Algonquin called them the winter walkers, beings of living ice that fed on warmth itself, on life. I'd always dismissed them as campfire stories meant to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. I know better now. The first direct sighting came during a night patrol 3 weeks after finding Webb's group. The temperature plummeted suddenly. My flashlight beamed dimming as if something was drinking the energy from its batteries. Movement caught my eye. A tall, vaguely humanoid shape made of translucent ice, shadowed organs visible through its crystalline form. It moved with horrible grace, flowing like water freezing in reverse. I ran. Anyone would have. But they were already spreading, drawn by the heat of summer and the warm bodies it brought to their hunting grounds. Reports started coming in from other rangers. Cold spots, missing hikers, strange ice formations in caves that seemed to shift position between patrols. We tried closing the trails, but bureaucracy moved too slowly. By the time the paperwork went through, they had grown bold, aggressive. We found entire campsites frozen solid, tents and all. The few survivors babbled about living ice and shadows that froze. Most were dismissed as hypothermic hallucinations. I knew better, but who would believe the truth? The siege began during the worst heat wave of the summer. Maybe that's what drove them to it. All that tempting warmth concentrated in one place. Station 23 was our main base of operations, housing 23 rangers and support staff. We thought the thick walls and modern heating system would protect us. We were wrong. They came just after sunset, materializing from the shadows like ice crystals forming in reverse. The temperature dropped 60 degrees in minutes. Our heating system strained and failed. Windows frosted over. Pipes burst. We tried calling for help, but the radio was dead. Frequencies blocked by whatever field of cold they generated. The first deaths were quick. Jim Martinez opened a door to check the generator and collapsed as 3 of them poured in, his body freezing before he hit the ground. Sarah Chen made it halfway down the hall before they caught her. The rest of us barricaded ourselves in the main office, watching through frosted windows as more of them emerged from the tree line. Dozens, hundreds. We had propane heaters, emergency supplies, enough to last a week, we thought. But the cold kept coming, and they kept multiplying. Every death seemed to birth new ones, like they were converting our lost heat and life into more of themselves. By the 3rd day, we were down to 8 survivors huddled around the last working heater. The walls were sheets of ice. The windows were clouded with frost too thick to see through, but we could hear them out there. A crackling, crystalline sound like ice expanding. Waiting. I knew then what I had to do. The ancient stories were clear. They spread through heat and life, multiplying exponentially. Left unchecked, they would breed and spread until they covered everything. But extreme cold slowed them, made them dormant. If I could drop the temperature low enough, fast enough, maybe I could force them into hibernation, stop their spread. The station had a liquid nitrogen storage unit for research samples. Releasing it would flash freeze everything in the building. Everyone in the building, including us. I didn't tell the others my plan. They would have tried to stop me, to find another way. But I'd seen what was coming. Better a quick death than letting these things spread, letting them reach the cities with their millions of warm bodies. The survivors were half unconscious from the cold when I made my move. I whispered an apology, took a deep breath, and smashed the nitrogen tank's release valve. The cold hit like a physical blow. The air itself seemed to crystallize. I felt the ice forming in my lungs, spreading through my blood. The last thing I saw was one of them watching through the frost-covered window, its translucent face pressed against the glass. Was it my imagination, or did it look almost disappointed as the killing cold claimed us all? The ice won't last forever. Eventually, someone will find us. Find them. I only hope they're ready. I hope they understand. If you're reading this, burn the station. Burn everything. Then run. The cold ones are patient, and they're spreading. They remember what it was like when glaciers covered the world, and they're happy to wait for those days to come again. Just remember, if you're hiking in the mountains and the temperature drops suddenly on a summer day, don't dismiss it. Don't try to be brave. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. But know in your heart it won't be far enough. The following was scrawled in shaking handwriting at the bottom of the last page. They're still out there, still waiting, in deep caves and dark hollows, in the shadows between snowflakes, waiting for the day when the warmth of the world gutters out like a candle and the ice comes again. And they're spreading. God help us all, they're spreading. I never wanted to write this down. Some things should stay buried in memory, locked away where they can't spread like a disease of the mind. But after what happened at Station 23 last August, I owe it to them, to everyone who died, to tell the truth. Maybe then someone will understand why I did what I did, why I had to. They'll find this journal eventually. The rangers who replace us will come looking when the radio silence stretches too long. They'll break through the ice-covered windows and find our frozen bodies, preserved like ancient specimens in a museum of horror. They'll want answers. This is my attempt to provide them, though I doubt anyone will believe me. I barely believe it myself, and I lived it. It started with Martin Webb's group, 3 experienced hikers who should have been perfectly fine on a marked summer trail. When the call came in about missing hikers, I figured it was the usual. Twisted ankle, wrong turn, maybe heat exhaustion. Just another routine search and rescue in the Adirondacks. Funny how your whole life can pivot on what you dismiss as routine. The morning was bright and warm when I set out, the kind of perfect July day that draws thousands to these mountains. Summer insects hummed in the undergrowth, and sunshine filtered through the canopy in lazy shafts. Everything normal. Everything right. I found their first campsite easily enough, following the coordinates from their permit. Nothing seemed disturbed. The tent was properly set up, sleeping bags laid out inside. Their food was still hanging in a bear bag, untouched. But something felt wrong in a way I couldn't name, like the forest was holding its breath. The temperature dropped as I followed their trail, which made no sense. The weather report showed highs in the 80s all week, yet my thermometer read 45 degrees. I pulled on my jacket, watching my breath cloud in air that should have been summer warm. I found Sarah Miller first, propped against a tree like she was resting. Her skin had a blue tinge I initially blamed on the strange light filtering through the leaves. But when I touched her arm, it was hard as marble, frozen solid. Her eyes were open, glazed with frost despite the warm air. I've seen my share of death in these mountains, but this was different. Wrong. Her expression wasn't one of pain or fear, just surprise, like something impossible had happened too quickly to process. The radio crackled when I called it in, static drowning half my words. The temperature kept dropping. By the time backup arrived, it was below freezing in a 10-foot radius around Sarah's body. We found Martin and Kevin half a mile ahead, in similar condition. The coroner later said their organs were crystallized, frozen from the inside out, like something had sucked the heat from their bodies, starting with their cores. I should have requested a transfer right then, should have walked away. But I've spent 20 years in these mountains. They're my responsibility, my home, so I stayed, started investigating, started noticing patterns in old reports I'd dismissed before. Missing hikers found frozen in summer heat, strange cold spots that moved against the wind, shadows that seemed too solid at twilight. The stories were always there in local legend, passed down by the original inhabitants of these mountains, tales of ancient things that came with the glaciers and never left, living in deep caves and forgotten hollows. The Algonquin called them the winter walkers, beings of living ice that fed on warmth itself, on life. I'd always dismissed them as campfire stories meant to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. I know better now. The first direct sighting came during a night patrol 3 weeks after finding Webb's group. The temperature plummeted suddenly. My flashlight beamed dimming as if something was drinking the energy from its batteries. Movement caught my eye. A tall, vaguely humanoid shape made of translucent ice, shadowed organs visible through its crystalline form. It moved with horrible grace, flowing like water freezing in reverse. I ran. Anyone would have. But they were already spreading, drawn by the heat of summer and the warm bodies it brought to their hunting grounds. Reports started coming in from other rangers. Cold spots, missing hikers, strange ice formations in caves that seemed to shift position between patrols. We tried closing the trails, but bureaucracy moved too slowly. By the time the paperwork went through, they had grown bold, aggressive. We found entire campsites frozen solid, tents and all. The few survivors babbled about living ice and shadows that froze. Most were dismissed as hypothermic hallucinations. I knew better, but who would believe the truth? The siege began during the worst heat wave of the summer. Maybe that's what drove them to it. All that tempting warmth concentrated in one place. Station 23 was our main base of operations, housing 23 rangers and support staff. We thought the thick walls and modern heating system would protect us. We were wrong. They came just after sunset, materializing from the shadows like ice crystals forming in reverse. The temperature dropped 60 degrees in minutes. Our heating system strained and failed. Windows frosted over. Pipes burst. We tried calling for help, but the radio was dead. Frequencies blocked by whatever field of cold they generated. The first deaths were quick. Jim Martinez opened a door to check the generator and collapsed as 3 of them poured in, his body freezing before he hit the ground. Sarah Chen made it halfway down the hall before they caught her. The rest of us barricaded ourselves in the main office, watching through frosted windows as more of them emerged from the tree line. Dozens, hundreds. We had propane heaters, emergency supplies, enough to last a week, we thought. But the cold kept coming, and they kept multiplying. Every death seemed to birth new ones, like they were converting our lost heat and life into more of themselves. By the 3rd day, we were down to 8 survivors huddled around the last working heater. The walls were sheets of ice. The windows were clouded with frost too thick to see through, but we could hear them out there. A crackling, crystalline sound like ice expanding. Waiting. I knew then what I had to do. The ancient stories were clear. They spread through heat and life, multiplying exponentially. Left unchecked, they would breed and spread until they covered everything. But extreme cold slowed them, made them dormant. If I could drop the temperature low enough, fast enough, maybe I could force them into hibernation, stop their spread. The station had a liquid nitrogen storage unit for research samples. Releasing it would flash freeze everything in the building. Everyone in the building, including us. I didn't tell the others my plan. They would have tried to stop me, to find another way. But I'd seen what was coming. Better a quick death than letting these things spread, letting them reach the cities with their millions of warm bodies. The survivors were half unconscious from the cold when I made my move. I whispered an apology, took a deep breath, and smashed the nitrogen tank's release valve. The cold hit like a physical blow. The air itself seemed to crystallize. I felt the ice forming in my lungs, spreading through my blood. The last thing I saw was one of them watching through the frost-covered window, its translucent face pressed against the glass. Was it my imagination, or did it look almost disappointed as the killing cold claimed us all? The ice won't last forever. Eventually, someone will find us. Find them. I only hope they're ready. I hope they understand. If you're reading this, burn the station. Burn everything. Then run. The cold ones are patient, and they're spreading. They remember what it was like when glaciers covered the world, and they're happy to wait for those days to come again. Just remember, if you're hiking in the mountains and the temperature drops suddenly on a summer day, don't dismiss it. Don't try to be brave. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. But know in your heart it won't be far enough. The following was scrawled in shaking handwriting at the bottom of the last page. They're still out there, still waiting, in deep caves and dark hollows, in the shadows between snowflakes. Waiting for the day when the warmth of the world gutters out like a candle and the ice comes again. And they're spreading. God help us all, they're spreading. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened during the February '83 avalanche response. The official report lists 6 fatalities, all members of my rescue team, with causes of death marked as exposure and misadventure. That sanitized paperwork sits in some government archive, telling nothing of the true horrors we encountered in those mountains. But after 40 years of silence, I feel compelled to finally share the truth. Maybe writing it down will help ease the burden of survival. Or maybe I just need someone else to know what really stalks those peaks when the storms roll in. My name is Diane Foster. In 1983, I was a ranger with Olympic National Park's Mountain Rescue Unit. I'd spent 8 years on the job by then, leading dozens of successful rescue operations in some of the worst conditions the Olympics could throw at us. The mountains had taken their share of lives over the years, but I'd never lost a team member. We were good at what we did. The best, actually. That's what made us so confident heading up that slope on February 13th. That's what made us so goddamn arrogant. The call came in around 2 a.m. A group of backcountry skiers had triggered a massive avalanche while attempting a night descent of Mount Anderson. Amateur move, especially given the unstable snowpack we'd been warning people about all season. But the emergency beacon was active, and park policy was clear. We responded to all distress calls, regardless of the circumstances that caused them. I assembled my A-team. Mike Chen, our medical specialist. Sarah O'Neill, who knew the mountain's topography better than anyone. The Jensen twins, Eric and Lars, our strongest climbers. Carlos Rodriguez, our most experienced snow expert. And David Mitchell, who could drive a snowcat through hell itself if he had to. We'd worked together for years, saved countless lives. The avalanche zone was in a tricky spot, but nothing we hadn't handled before. The weather was clear when we started up in the snowcat, stars sharp as ice picks against the black sky. The forecast called for a storm system moving in later that day, but we figured we'd have the rescue wrapped up well before then. Standard procedure. Locate survivors, stabilize any injuries, transport back to base. 6 hours tops. The first sign something was wrong came about an hour into our ascent. The temperature dropped suddenly, not the gradual chill you expect with elevation gain, but a sharp plunge that frosted our goggles and froze the moisture in our breath. Must have dropped 20 degrees in the span of minutes. Carlos, who'd been monitoring conditions, started muttering in Spanish. When I asked what was wrong, he just shook his head. Air mass is all wrong, he said finally. This kind of temperature inversion, it's not natural. I should have listened to him, should have turned us around right then. But the beacon was still broadcasting, which meant someone up there might still be alive. So we pressed on. We reached the avalanche zone just as dawn was breaking, though you could hardly tell through the thick cloud cover that had materialized around us. The scene was wrong. I'd worked plenty of avalanche sites before, but this was different. The snowfield was massive, easily half a mile wide, but the debris pattern made no sense. Instead of the typical downslope flow pattern you'd expect, the snow and wreckage was scattered in concentric circles, as if something had exploded outward from a central point. And the bodies. God, the bodies. We found the first one about 50 yards in. Female, probably mid-20s, wearing high-end ski gear. She'd been torn apart, limbs scattered across the snow like a broken doll. But the wounds weren't consistent with avalanche trauma. The tears were too clean, too deliberate. Like something had systematically dismembered her. Mountain lion, maybe? Eric suggested, but his voice shook. We all knew mountain lions don't hunt like this. We found 4 more bodies in similar conditions, as we worked our way across the debris field. All showed the same precise dismemberment pattern. All had the same expression of absolute terror frozen on their faces. The snow around each body was stained pink, but there was less blood than there should have been, like something had been feeding. The storm hit around noon, appearing out of nowhere. 1 minute visibility was decent. The next, we could barely see 10 feet in any direction. The wind howled like a living thing, driving needles of ice into any exposed skin. Our radios crackled with static, then died completely. The temperature dropped another 30 degrees. "We need to get out of here," Carlos shouted over the wind. "This storm isn't natural. Nothing about this is natural." He was right, of course. But as we turned to head back to the Snowcat, I saw something that made my blood freeze solid in my veins. Tracks in the snow. Massive, elongated prints unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They formed a perfect circle around our position, as if something had been pacing, watching us. And they were fresh. That's when we heard it. A sound that still haunts my nightmares. Part howl, part screech, but with an almost human quality that made it infinitely worse. It echoed off the mountains, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "There's more than one," she whispered. She was right. The calls were coming from multiple directions now, growing closer. Through the swirling snow, I caught glimpses of movement. Tall, pale shapes gliding between the trees at the edge of the avalanche field. The storm intensified, the wind now so fierce it nearly knocked us off our feet. "The cat!" David yelled. "We have to get to the cat!" We ran. God help us. We ran like scared children through that hellish whiteout. The shapes kept pace easily, herding us like cattle. Every few seconds another one of those horrible cries would pierce the air, closer each time. The cold was beyond anything I'd ever experienced, burning in our lungs and freezing our tears to our faces. We never reached the Snowcat. Looking back, I don't think we were ever running in the right direction. The things in the storm were toying with us, driving us deeper into their territory. When Mike went down, screaming about frostbite, we had no choice but to seek shelter. The old emergency cabin was barely visible through the snow, a dark square against all that white. We stumbled inside and barricaded the door with everything we could find. The cabin was basic: 4 walls, some bunks, a wood stove, and emergency supplies. The twins got a fire going while I did a supply check. 2 weeks of freeze-dried food, assuming careful rationing. Plenty of water, first aid kit, emergency radio that, like our handhelds, produced nothing but static. Through the cabin's single window, I could see only white. The storm showed no signs of letting up. That first night was the longest of my life. The things outside kept up their awful chorus, circling the cabin for hours. Occasionally, something heavy would slam against the walls, making the whole structure shudder. None of us slept. We huddled around the stove, jumping at every sound. Mike's frostbite was bad. Both feet and several fingers had turned black. Sarah treated him as best she could, but we all knew he needed real medical attention soon. The storm raged for 3 days straight. We took turns watching and sleeping, though real rest was impossible with those things constantly prowling outside. The twins tried to maintain morale, telling jokes and stories, but their voices were strained. We all felt it, a creeping dread that went beyond fear of death, like we were being hunted by something that wanted more than just our lives. On the 4th day, the food started running low. Carlos swore he'd packed extra rations in his bag, but they were nowhere to be found. The same with David's pack. Food just seemed to disappear. We cut portions again, trying to stretch what remained. The cold was getting worse, too, seeping through the walls despite the constant fire. Or maybe it was coming from inside us. I caught Sarah staring at her hands once, watching frost crystals form on her skin despite being right next to the stove. Mike died on day 5. The frostbite had spread despite our best efforts, turning his limbs black up to the knees and elbows. Near the end, he was delirious, rambling about pale figures standing over his bunk, reaching for him with long, sharp fingers. We wrapped his body as best we could and moved it outside. We had no choice. The cabin was too small to share with a corpse. The next morning, Mike's body was gone. The snow where we'd laid him was disturbed, marked with those same massive tracks we'd seen on the avalanche field. But there was something else too. Smaller tracks, human boots, leading away from the cabin and back again. That's when the real horror started, because those tracks could only have been made by one of us. The hunger hit hard on day 6. Not normal hunger. This was something primitive and awful that gnawed at our souls as much as our bellies. We stopped talking, stopped doing anything but staring at each other with sunken eyes. I caught David licking blood from his cracked lips while watching Carlos sleep. The twins whispered to each other constantly in Swedish, falling silent whenever anyone came too close. Sarah was the first to say what we were all thinking. "There's meat outside," she said quietly one night. "Fresh meat, in the snow." We all knew what she meant. The things out there they'd been leaving. Pieces. Animals mostly, we told ourselves. But some of the chunks looked too pale, too familiar. We could smell them through the walls, rich and sweet and tempting. Carlos started vomiting every time the scent drifted in. David just breathed deeper. On day 7, Lars Jensen went missing. 1 minute he was huddled in his bunk. The next he was just gone. The door hadn't opened. Eric went completely silent after that, staring at nothing for hours. That night, we heard Lars screaming outside. It went on for a long time. None of us moved to help him. We couldn't, because mixed with his screams were sounds of feeding. Eric broke the next morning. He stripped off his clothes and walked straight out into the storm, calling his brother's name. We watched through the window as the pale shapes emerged from the swirling snow, circling him almost gently. He didn't fight when they reached for him, didn't even scream. After that, everything starts to blur. The hunger became unbearable, an actual physical force trying to tear its way out of us. The temperature kept dropping, ice forming inside the cabin no matter how hot we kept the fire. We could hear them outside constantly now, calling to us with voices that sounded more human each day, calling us to join them. Carlos went next, though whether he walked out on his own or was taken, I couldn't say. I was sleeping, or trying to. Woke to David standing over me, snow in his hair, blood frozen on his chin. Sarah was curled in the corner, gnawing on something I refused to look at too closely. I remember the moment I finally understood. It wasn't just about hunger, about survival. The things out there, the Wendigo, though I couldn't bring myself to use that word then, they were changing us. Every bite of forbidden meat, every degree of impossible cold, every hour spent listening to their calls. We were becoming like them. The realization should have horrified me. Instead, I felt relief. When David and Sarah turned on each other, I didn't intervene. I watched them tear into each other like animals, their bodies already beginning to elongate, skin turning pale as the snow outside. And when they were done, when the cabin floor was slick with blood and worse things, I joined in. Had to. It was that or starve. The storm broke on day 12. The sun rose on a transformed landscape, everything white and clean and beautiful. I stood in the doorway of the cabin, feeling the cold wind on my skin. It didn't burn anymore. Nothing hurt anymore. I was so very, very hungry, but that was okay. There would always be more food, more victims to draw into our territory, more members to add to the pack. I can feel them coming now, drawn by the memory. The wind is picking up outside my window, carrying the promise of snow. Soon the storms will roll in, and we'll hunt together again, my beautiful, terrible family. I've spent 40 years leading them, teaching them to be patient, to be clever, teaching them to make each kill last, to savor every morsel of meat and terror. So let me offer this warning, though I know some will ignore it. When the weather turns bad in the Olympics, when the storms come from nowhere and the cold cuts deeper than it should, stay off the mountains. The things you see moving through the snow, the shadows that look almost human, they're not tricks of the light. And those screams on the wind, that's not your imagination. It's just me and my team doing our jobs. Still the best rescue unit in the park. Still haven't lost a single member. Not really. From the personal papers of Diane Foster, found in her cabin following her disappearance, February 13, 2023,